All right, hey everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday Tech Talk. Today we have our very own Leonhardt, who's going to talk to us about a lot of cool things of Kotlin. I'm excited and hope you are too. So without further ado, take it away.
Great. Hey guys, thanks everyone for coming. For the last year and a half, I've been playing with Kotlin. Started with a little experimentation after hours with some friends. Eventually, I rolled onto a project where we were using it at Pivotal Labs with a client. And now it's my favorite JVM language. It's changed the way I build applications a little bit, I think for the better. And today I just want to share a couple highlights about the language. My goal for this presentation is to introduce you to Kotlin so you'll know why to consider using it for our project, maybe even particularly a Spring Boot project. But if you're not going to be working with Spring in the near future, I think it's just a general overview as well. But that being said, I think it does work really well with Spring. The Spring framework has invested a lot of work in some recent releases and some upcoming releases that make the language work very well with the framework. Sebastian, who's one of the Spring framework committers at Pivotal, said, "The more I write Spring Boot applications with Kotlin, the more I feel these two technologies share the same mindset and allow you to write applications more efficiently with expressive, short, and readable code." So, that being said, what is Kotlin? Kotlin is, like Java, a statically typed programming language. It is object-oriented, but it's also functional in that functions are first-class citizens of the language, allowing you to blend the two styles very well. And it runs on the JVM. It's fully interoperable with Java code, which is reduces the largest barrier to entry. If you have an existing Java code base, you can write one Kotlin class and reference Java objects. Java objects can reference Kotlin objects. And it does that by producing Java-compatible bytecode. It's endorsed by Google as an official language on Android. Google itself didn't create Kotlin, but works so well that they made an announcement. And a lot of Android development is happening on Kotlin right now. We won't go into this today, but interesting to note and important to understand where Kotlin's going. It also transpiles to JavaScript. So some people are writing web apps with Kotlin. There's some examples of React being written entirely in Kotlin. And it also works with the LLVM compiler infrastructure to produce bytecode for when using a virtual machine doesn't really make a lot of sense. So who made Kotlin? It was developed by JetBrains, which is the company that makes the IDE IntelliJ and a lot of other developer tools. The thing about Kotlin compared to a lot of other languages that have come about with some of these features, maybe like Swift, is JetBrains has used Kotlin in production for years. So long before 1.0, it had been really hardened. They introduced Kotlin to their own 10-year-old code base as they were developing it, and they paid a lot of attention to making sure projects which mix Java and Kotlin work very smoothly, with a primary goal of the language being interoperability with Java. So, but besides JetBrains, who's using Kotlin in production? I stole this slide from Andrei Breslov. He's the lead language designer of Kotlin. He gave a recent talk about Kotlin as well. These are a few logos. So there is a community now. You can find resources online. And then with regards to our process, these are some of the projects in Pivotal Labs where we've used Kotlin with clients. Has anyone here used Kotlin at Pivotal Labs or at Pivotal yet? Nina has. What did you work on, Nina? Cool. So she worked on the Orange London project. Anyone else work on a Kotlin project? With a client? No? Well, anyway, we do have a lot of experience within the company now. There's a lot of knowledge within our company to lean on now. A lot of great examples. So why all the interest in Kotlin? There's a few language features that differentiate it from the other natural option on the JVM Java. This isn't a comprehensive overview of the language, but it's just a few of the essentials. Hopefully it will pique your interest in the rest of the language features. So the big one that gets talked about a lot is null references. In Kotlin, they're controlled by the type system. It's often referred to as the billion-dollar mistake in Java. But for me, being able to control null references and the presence or absence of a value helps me describe my domain better, describe my business logic better by keeping it in the type system. So in Java, I'm going to a couple of code examples. I hope they're not too verbose. I tried to keep them small. Let's say you have a dog. This is a Java dog. Has a name and an age. And let's say you want to use this dog somewhere. So you create a new dog, and you assign its name Lassie, and then you want to do something with the values. And here you'll get a null pointer exception. And maybe you might think that dogs all have an age, like the absence of that value doesn't make a lot of sense. However, there's not really a great way to describe that if you're using a Java class as your domain, representation of your domain object. So you might end up doing some stuff like this. Checking for null when you're using it. In Kotlin, we have these vals. Vals are non-nullable. Vars are nullable. So you could just declare a class, a Kotlin dog, where these things must be present. And then the compiler will help you here. You can't construct one without giving it a value for age. So then you're forced to do that. And this provides a lot more value when you aren't constructing the object right here, but let's say you're passed a reference to this object. Let me go back. You pass a reference to this object, and the compiler will ensure that you're either handling it or that you don't need to handle it. For instance, here, if we change var, and we change the age to a var, so maybe this is a nullable value now. Maybe we don't know the age of some dogs. I'm going to go back. Then there's things like the Elvis operator you might be familiar with in other languages, or conditionals, or whatever you want to do to be able to handle that. But having these options allows you to model your data a little better. And you might have seen I chose to write the Kotlin dog with something called a data class. In Kotlin, a data class is available, which is a special type of class. It's best used for modeling data. So in Java, let's say back to this Java dog, you have two values, but let's say you want to make these fields private. You want some getters and setters. You're going to need equals, hash code, toString. Looks like I'm missing that example, but Java developers will probably know that this is a really large thing to maintain. There's not a lot of help from the language itself. And there are tools like Lombok that sometimes we employ, sometimes we don't like them because they are doing weird things with the code. With Kotlin, with this data class, is a really special type of class. You get all those things for free. It's built into the language. One of the things that I'm frustrated with the most when I'm working with Java is maintaining my data objects, and their sense of equality. When I like the default values of this, it's basically what I want all the time. Oh, here's my example. Yeah. So there might be more terse ways to represent this, but this usually looks something like this in Java. So Kotlin has a concept of restricted class hierarchies. So this is, you have inheritance between objects, which you have in Java as well. But there's a really cool thing called a sealed class. And a sealed class can only be subclassed by a finite set of other classes. That allows you to know the category of subclasses. So this allows you to put more of your business logic in your type system. So what did I do here? This is a dog kennel, and it has one function to check in a dog. And it returns this, this check-in result. You can use restricted class hierarchies and sealed classes for a lot of things, but I love using them as result objects for my functions. So if I return this check-in result, you'll see check-in result has two subclasses here. One is a success, and one is a failure. And then failure, in order to instantiate it, you need to give it a reason. This is just some data I put together. And in the check-in failure, there's two options that are explicitly declared. One is the kennel is full, and one is the kennel is closed. So it's either going to succeed in checking this dog into the kennel, or you're going to fail for one of two reasons. And up here, you must return one of these check-in results. So what I did here is, if there's too many dogs in the kennel, I'm going to return kennel is full. I didn't show an example of when the kennel's closed, but you can imagine that my example was getting a little long. So this gets interesting when you want to determine what happened in the result when you call this function. So this is a dog owner who has a dog, Fido. It has a reference to the kennel. And they want to figure out what to do over the weekend when they want to go away for the weekend. So they need to handle their dog for the weekend. So first they're going to try to check their dog into the kennel. They're going to get a result back, that result object we created. And then there's this cool when statement here. In Kotlin, it replaces the case and the switch in the case. And it's a different idea. And you get a couple of these cool keywords here. So when the result, I can say when it's this success object, when it's it is a success object or a subclass of it. I'm going to return from this function, enjoy your weekend getaway. If it was a failure, and then I'm going to dig in further and check out the reason. If the reason was the kennel was full, say kennel is booked up, you need to stay home. But I've got a compile time error here. This red squiggly on the when is because the when expression must be exhaustive. I need to add the necessary kennel close branch. So by putting sort of my error handling and my business logic in my type system, I'm getting some help from the compiler to ensure that I'm not missing something here. And so what I really need to do is I need another branch here to handle what about when the kennel's closed. And so even with some autocomplete, I can kind of generate this extra branch and then write this extra part here to say the kennel is closed. You showed up too late. And so in Java, I might have handled this another way. I might have thrown a runtime exception or a checked exception. I might have built another type of result object myself and returned that maybe has some state in it that I'll have to check. But then I need to know about, oh, go ahead.
Can you show us how result reason is being defined? What's the type of?
Yeah, I know it's a lot of content. So I did that on a previous slide. I I failed to keep them on the same slide. It was getting a little too crowded. So these are inner classes here of the dog kennel, and I just did that because they're associated with the kennel here.
So the compiler won't know the reason.
Yeah, and because this is a sealed class, this sealed keyword tells the compiler that sealed classes can't be instantiated themselves. So they have to, if you want to instantiate it, you have to subclass it. And you have to subclass it here in the declaration. And that's the only place you can declare them. And then the compiler knows the exhaustive list of possible subclasses here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so checking result is your result on the other page, and then we have two options: object successful, failure.
Yes.
But you have reason checking failure. Okay, and then it's kennel.
Yeah. Yeah. This here is a value of, it's an attribute of the failure. So you could just say, back on, let me go to the next one here. I could have just said, if it's a failure, return didn't work. But I'm digging into, the other interesting thing is the compiler also knows by this point that this result object is a failure. So it knows that result will have a reason, which is not on the success object. So there's a lot of inference going on here to really help you out.
And when you read this code, if you didn't write it, it's not too hard for you to track it. When you're inside your TLJ, you just click and it will take you to many different reasons.
Yeah. Yes. And when I was writing this out, I actually, unlike Java, because Kotlin is a really functional language, they allow you to declare as many classes or functions as you want on the same file. Not that you necessarily want to do that, but you have the option. Cool. So yeah, so now we handled all this. I've been using this pattern a lot in my HTTP resources in my Spring controllers. I promise this is the thickest one. But here I created a dog repository, and this is a controller where you could make a post here and try to dog/ID/booking kennel. And you could look up this dog. And you get this result back. And then so you have the same sort of structure here. But what I'm doing is I'm allowing the controller to go over this high-level domain description of the possible successes and failures and do the translation to HTTP statuses and response bodies using this here. And if I continue to declare my sort of all of my success and failure cases all together in the type system, then I even in my controllers here, I'm going to get some help in making sure I've covered all the cases I've explicitly handled. And so what starts to happen when I do this, or when we do this, is I'm not going to throw in exceptions. In fact, I've started to wrap my third-party things that do throw exceptions, and I'll catch them and translate them into the type system, so I can handle everything first class like this.
But here, if you don't get a dog, if you don't find a dog by ID,
Yep.
what do you get? Wrapping this error into a null object?
Great question. So I started this slide by showing that as well, but I was afraid you wouldn't be able to read it. So I just did this optional.get, which would blow up. But you can do I could have done like when dog optional is present, and it would call that is present function on the optional object, and then I could return maybe a not found or something.
So here, if you don't find it, it will blow up, right?
Yes, but that was only for brevity, so this slide wasn't too large. That's correct. Because this optional class comes from the Java language, this function throws a runtime exception, and Kotlin's not going to change that for you. So you need to interface that somehow.
I guess, yeah, to Matt's point, like, I would have expected it to enforce handling, like, that the compiler enforce handling what happens if that dog optional is null, right?
Yes.
The compiler basically say, hey, you missed handling this null.
And in the version of Spring JPA I'm using, this JPA method find by ID returns an optional. They changed that API recently, and so it's kind of wrapped up in that optional object at the moment. But however, if the old behavior of data JPA, I think the library is called, is this returned null. So I wouldn't have, in that case, it would have been what you expected, Ross, and you wouldn't have been able to assign this to a val. You would have gotten a compile time error there. That would have actually been a more clear example. So you would have had to assign it to a var, and the compiler would have made you handle the nullability there. Cool. Yeah, and Kotlin doesn't have checked exceptions. So I think that the language is encouraging you to do more of these, to handle more of this with the type system. That's kind of all I want to say here.
Do you wrap every single error you can have into the type system?
I mean, it's up to you. So you still have runtime exceptions. You can still handle errors another way that you would have in Java. But that's what I've been doing, and that's probably my favorite thing I've started to change in my applications. So personal preference for me, yes, I do. Yeah. Any other questions? That's kind of all I had for today.
What's the worst thing in Kotlin? What is the one thing you're like, oh man, I wish they didn't do it that way?
Worst thing.
Or is something you wish they could improve the next version?
So type inference is a really powerful thing in Kotlin, and I've started to, with all these subclasses and seal classes, I started trying to create maybe some more functional extensions of a result object with maps and map errors and traverses, and sometimes the type inference breaks down when you start to do really crazy things. So you have to explicitly define it, and that gets a little verbose. That's a real subtle thing. Just with generics with angle brackets. That's one that comes to mind where I'm like, I think the compiler is going to get better, and I can remove all these angle brackets.
Computation speed?
It's on par with Java. That was one of their biggest goals. That's why JetBrains didn't want to use Scala. It's an article I read. So there's some tests you can find online. Sometimes it's a little better, but on average it's on par.
When is it that you would not use Kotlin and you would use Java instead?
So sometimes it's organizational. It's the biggest one. Is do I want to, in addition to all the other things I'm introducing to this team, to this organization, do I want to introduce a new language? It's very similar to Java, in my opinion. Draw your own conclusions. There's some things, but I think it's easier than ReactiveX or something, which is still in Java, but a big heavyweight library. I think it's easier to learn this syntax. But sometimes, if you don't have the expertise or the interest, if you don't have people that want to learn something else and are okay with some Java classes and some Kotlin classes in the same repo, that's usually been the only reason I haven't chosen to use it.
Another question.
Yeah. Please keep it up. We have some time, so.
So what is the first error you encountered when you started writing Kotlin? Like the first thing you have to go and go Stack Overflow and figure out.
Yeah, great question. A lot of the tooling with Spring, say JPA or Jackson, the constructors are different now. We have name parameters in the constructors. We don't have default constructors. And so there's been a lot of tooling in the frameworks to some tooling changes in the other libraries. So Jackson, if you give it a JSON payload to a controller, you have to bring in this extra, I think they might have fixed it in like the Spring Boot 2 milestone releases, but you have to add all these extra Kotlin Jackson things. That was frustrating for a while. Part of giving this talk is this impending Spring Boot 2 release. I think they really did it all over. Spring Framework 5's out. Spring Data JPA just hit general availability yesterday, which changed some of my examples. Today I was going to do this Data JPA one of this big workaround I've been doing for the last year, and now I realize it's not necessary anymore. So I tried to fix that example, but ended up dropping it. So that's been the biggest pain point, is because all of my JVM projects are Spring, making sure the framework's ready for it. But that being said, I have worked on labs projects that did Kotlin Spring and just worked with them. I think it's been mature enough already. Yeah.
Do you have to open your Kotlin classes that are used in the dependency section?
Great question. Yes. And I might have there's a Gradle plugin. I'm sure there's a Maven equivalent. I typically use Gradle, called Kotlin Spring, that will look for the annotations, and at compile time do some magic and open the ones you need to, so you don't have to do that yourself. Might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't like that. I always remove it from my projects because I like to know what my framework's doing, and I want to know that I want to add all those open keywords myself. And in fact, IntelliJ gives you really great detail on that. If you don't have that plugin, you'll get the checks from IntelliJ saying, hey, this function or this class needs to be open because this is a repository, or this is a bean definition. Yeah.
Did your testing strategy change now that some stuff is enforced by the compiler?
Yes. He asked if my testing strategy has changed with more things being enforced by the compiler. Yeah, that's something I'm struggling with right now. Is I'm starting to not test some of my error my error cases because I'm like, well, it just wouldn't have compiled. So I haven't really worked in a language that had strong type systems like this before. So this is an experiment for me right now, figuring out how to adjust my testing strategy. But lately, I've been testing less of my errors explicitly because I know how they work. But that's probably a stylistic and team thing to navigate. Yeah.
Another one is more related around. So you've decided as a team to do this, but your team is all Java developers who only heard vague rumblings of Kotlin. How is introducing that work? Because I know you could just write the same Java code. You don't need to use sealed classes to do what you did. You could write it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to learn a little bit, or you'd probably mess something up. But I really think the barrier to entry is so low. I mean, having taught a Java developer Swift before, and that was just a foregone conclusion that we would do that. I think you need a much lower appetite just to do this, to do the Kotlin move. That's kind of my answer. Is the syntax is so similar. You don't need to redo your whole code base at the same time, or that doesn't even have to be an explicit goal. I found that because the syntax is so similar, and that was an intention in the language, that it's about as easy as it gets. So it's if you're willing to learn anything new, I think this is probably in the set of things you would learn, or be willing to learn.
The only thing is you can open in IntelliJ, you can right-click on Java code and convert it into plugin, which to me, when I play with the language, I'm like, oh wow, okay, well that's saving me a lot of time.
Yeah, yeah.
That works well.
It works very well. Sometimes it might be a little. There's a couple things I'll tweak. I'll be like, I don't. Yeah, there's this. I'll do that a different way, but it'll compile and it'll run the same way. I've never had an issue with it not being logically correct.
But isn't it also something because you can really choose to write more Java as Kotlin, where you kind of stick to what Java has too, and you write in Kotlin, or more idiomatic Kotlin that you show with sealed classes, where you really use all the more.
Yeah. And it's yeah. I mean, you still got ifs. You don't have switches anymore, but you can say return if, and then the body of the if will be returned, or the else's, or you could still put all your returns in there if you don't know about that syntax. You don't have to necessarily do idiomatic. But if you're using an IntelliJ, it'll let you know you're not doing it idiomatic. Yeah.
Are your feelings about the Kotlin JPA, the plugin for Gradle, the same as your Kotlin Spring?
I was just talking to Spring Framework guys on Slack today. You might have seen that. That was me scrambling to try to adjust that previous example into like, oh my God, they made this general availability release, and like my example is now defunct. But I don't know yet. I think it's the cost of what I was doing. And let me frame this explanation a little bit for everyone else. Data classes, I can have non-nullable values, right? So I can say val name is a string, and I like that because if I'm pulling something out of the database, maybe my column in my SQL wasn't non-nullable, but my understanding of it is, I just want it to blow up right there and find that problem and go handle it there. Do a migration and fix it rather than bring it all the way up to my controllers and have a bug in my application. As one example. So I've been wanting to use data classes as my entities. That's because they're great for describing your domain objects. But JPA really doesn't understand Kotlin yet. If you're using something like Redis or Mongo, they have their own sort of data non-JPA constructs that are ready to go. There is a plugin for Gradle, and I'm assuming Maven as well, that allows you to do magic things on your entities to make them compatible with Java. Give them default constructors and wrap them in probably some ugly Java thing that you never have to see. The workaround I was doing to basically have my pristine domain objects and translate them into everything non-nullable with default values of null to make JPA happy was really large and ugly. So I think I'm okay with the reflection utilities coming in with that Gradle plugin and doing some magic there. But I've only been fully aware of what was going on there for about a couple hours. So maybe we can work on it sometime. Yeah, Tommy.
What would you say that Kotlin makes much easier in Spring?
Does Kotlin make much easier in Spring? He asked, what does Kotlin make much easier in Spring? It's a good question. I think Spring specifically, there's a couple DSL things that are a lot cleaner, but that's kind of low priority for me. I would say that the benefits I'm experiencing myself are probably Spring agnostic, which is why I changed the title of this presentation. It used to be Kotlin patterns for Spring, and then as I worked out my presentation, I realized none of this was really that Spring specific. I think it's actually maybe been a little bit of the reverse in the last 6 months, where it was like I really want to do this Kotlin thing, and it's almost there with Spring, and I'll work around the speed bumps right now, and those are getting smoothed over by the Spring team pretty quickly. I would say it's more about on par, and then I like the syntax better. It's a little bit more terse, and there's some cool things with the DSL. I really been experimenting with WebFlux instead of WebMVC, and I like the way to define that with the Kotlin DSL. There's some things like that. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.